Along the vast Atlantic coast, 13 English colonies took root, each one a unique experiment in survival and ambition. These settlements, stretching from the rocky shores of New England to the warm, fertile lands of the South, were shaped by the dreams and struggles of those who dared to cross the ocean. Every colony was molded by hope and hardship, as families and individuals braved the unknown, seeking a better life and a place to call their own. These settlers, farmers, merchants, artisans, were not just building towns, they were forging a new idea. A society based on self-determination, where people could shape their own destinies and communities. In places like Jamestown and Plymouth, survival was never guaranteed. Disease, harsh winters, and scarce resources threatened their existence. Yet the promise of freedom and opportunity drew waves of immigrants from across Europe, each bringing their own hopes and traditions. The North developed bustling port cities, thriving on trade and commerce, alongside small family farms that dotted the countryside. Meanwhile, the South's plantations flourished with tobacco, rice, and cotton, built on the backs of enslaved Africans, whose forced labor became the foundation of the Southern economy and society. By the mid-1700s, the colonies had developed distinct identities, their own legislatures, and a growing sense of unity, even as regional differences persisted. Enlightenment ideas of liberty, equality, and self-government spread rapidly, fueling passionate debates in taverns, churches, and town squares. Colonists began to question old ways and imagine new possibilities. A new generation, born and raised in America, started to see themselves as something more than British subjects. They felt a growing sense of identity and belonging to this new land. Tensions simmered as colonial assemblies clashed with royal governors, and protests erupted against British policies. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide whether these colonists would remain subjects of a distant king or become citizens of a new nation. The American story was about to begin, a story of revolution, resilience, and the birth of a nation unlike any the world had ever seen. Tensions with Britain erupted in the 1770s as the American colonies found themselves increasingly at odds with the distant British crown. The colonists, who had grown used to a degree of autonomy, now faced new restrictions and a growing sense of injustice. As new taxes and laws like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts sparked outrage in the colonies, everyday people began to organize and resist. The sense of unity among the colonists grew stronger with each new imposition. Protests escalated, most famously the Boston Tea Party, where colonists defiantly dumped British tea into Boston Harbor, sending a clear message of resistance to the world. Tensions finally exploded into violence, and soon, the first shots of revolution rang out at Lexington and Concord. These battles marked the beginning of a long and uncertain struggle for freedom. Against the world's mightiest army, the Continental Army, led by George Washington, fought for independence. Through harsh winters, scarce resources, and overwhelming odds, the determination of the Patriots never wavered. The Declaration of Independence, adopted in 1776, boldly proclaimed that all men are created equal, setting a new standard for human rights. This document not only declared freedom from Britain, but also inspired future generations to pursue liberty. After years of hardship and pivotal victories, the war ended with the British surrender at Yorktown. The dream of an independent nation had become a reality, but the challenges were far from over. Independence won, the new nation struggled under the weak Articles of Confederation. The government lacked the power to tax or regulate trade, and unity among the states was fragile at best. In 1787, delegates from across the states gathered in Philadelphia to craft the U.S. Constitution, establishing a federal republic with checks and balances. This new framework aimed to create a stronger, more effective government while protecting individual freedoms. George Washington became the first president, guiding the fragile republic through its uncertain beginnings. His leadership set important precedents for the office and helped unite the young nation. The American experiment in self-government had begun, with citizens participating in shaping their own destiny for the first time. The ideals of liberty and equality would shape the nation's future and its ongoing struggles. These principles would be tested and redefined as America grew and changed. A new era was underway, filled with hope, ambition, and the promise of a nation built on revolutionary ideals. With independence secured, America looked west, driven by Manifest Destiny and the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the nation's size. Settlers, trappers, and pioneers pushed into new territories, often at the expense of Native Americans. The nation's rapid expansion fueled conflict over slavery, as each new state threatened the balance between free and slave states. Political compromises failed to resolve the growing divide. Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 triggered Southern secession and the outbreak of the Civil War. Brother fought brother in a brutal conflict that claimed over 620,000 lives. The war's outcome would determine whether the nation, founded on liberty, could survive its deepest contradictions. America's future hung in the balance. The Union's victory ended slavery, but Reconstruction's promise of equality was short-lived as Jim Crow laws took hold in the South. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution transformed America. Railroads, steel, oil, and electricity fueled explosive growth. Immigrants from Europe and Asia flocked to booming cities, powering factories but facing hardship and discrimination. The Gilded Age saw vast wealth for a few and poverty for many, sparking calls for reform. By the early 20th century, America's industrial might propelled it onto the world stage. The Spanish-American War marked the start of overseas expansion. World War I drew the U.S. into global conflict, and American intervention helped tip the balance. Emerging from the war, the United States was now a major world power. The nation's role in global affairs was just beginning. The Roaring Twenties brought prosperity and cultural change, but the Great Depression soon shattered the illusion. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal redefined government's role, providing relief and hope but not full recovery. As totalitarian regimes rose abroad, World War II erupted. The attack on Pearl Harbor thrust America into a global fight for survival. The nation mobilized, its factories and soldiers turning the tide in both Europe and the Pacific. Victory in 1945 left the U.S. as the world's leading economic and military power. The devastation elsewhere made America the architect of the post-war order. The American century had begun, with the nation poised to shape the world's future. Yet new challenges loomed on the horizon. The struggle for peace and justice was far from over. The end of World War II did not bring lasting peace, but instead marked the beginning of a new era of tension and rivalry, the Cold War. This was a global standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, two superpowers with opposing ideologies, each determined to shape the world in its own image. Across continents, proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam became battlegrounds for these competing visions. American soldiers fought far from home, while back in the United States the conflict sparked fierce debate and protest, dividing families and communities. The ever-present threat of nuclear war cast a long shadow over daily life. From missile silos to classroom drills, Americans lived with the anxiety that a single misstep could lead to global catastrophe, shaping both foreign and domestic policy for generations. Meanwhile, at home, the nation faced its own battles. The civil rights movement rose up to challenge the deep-rooted injustices of segregation and discrimination, demanding equality and dignity for all Americans. Leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. inspired millions to join the struggle. Landmark legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act, began to dismantle legal segregation. Yet the fight for true justice and equality was far from over as activists continued to push for change in every corner of society. The 1960s and 70s became a time of transformation. Movements for women's rights, environmental protection, and peace challenged the status quo, while a new generation questioned traditional values and demanded a more just and inclusive America. Political scandals, most notably Watergate, shook the nation's faith in its leaders and institutions, leading to a widespread sense of disillusionment and a call for greater transparency in government. The Cold War era finally ended with the dramatic fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, events that signaled a new chapter in world history and the triumph of democratic ideals. America emerged as the world's sole superpower, its influence felt across the globe. Yet with this new role came new questions about the nation's identity, responsibilities, and the values it would champion in a rapidly changing world. As the 20th century drew to a close, the United States stood at a crossroads, facing the challenge of defining its soul and purpose for the generations to come. The post-Cold War era brought economic growth and technological revolution, but also new vulnerabilities. The September 11th attacks reshaped foreign policy and led to long wars abroad. The digital age transformed society, fueling both innovation and division. America grew more diverse, but political polarization deepened. Economic crises and contentious politics tested the nation's unity. The story of America remains one of contradiction, freedom and inequality, opportunity and struggle. As the nation faces the challenges of the 21st century, the question endures. Can Americans forge a common future and strive for a more perfect union? The answer is still being written.